Hey, this is Kalen, and welcome to The Drop. In this episode, the second of a two-part series, we're discussing the economic impact of California's State Water Project. Joining us is Professor at the College of Natural Resources at UC Berkeley and Vice Chairman of the Berkeley Research Group, Dr. David Sunding. Dr. Sunding, thank you so much for being with us today. Let's start off with maybe just a short intro into your background and qualifications on the matter.
Yeah, sure. So I am a professor at Berkeley. I teach environmental economics and natural resource economics. I also teach in the law school as part of our law and economics sequence. I've been working on California water issues for more than 25 years. Being an economist that studies public finance in California, you find your way to water sooner or later. There's a lot of interesting issues to work on, and it's an important question in the state. So being at a big public university in California, it was kind of natural that I would end up working on water. But I've worked on a number of different issues, environmental regulations affecting water use, economic evaluation of different water infrastructure projects. Worked a lot on the subject of agricultural water use, water markets. Water trading is quite interesting. And then increasingly working on groundwater issues because those have become incredibly important as the state tries to ensure that its groundwater resources are sustainable. So no shortage of interesting issues to work on in California water.
Could you maybe give us kind of a high-level overview, 30,000-foot level of what the State Water Project is, just maybe for the benefit of those who either just don't know or could use a refresh?
Sure. So the State Water Project was completed in the 1960s, and it was intended to solve a basic problem in California, which is that the rainfall occurs primarily to the north of the Bay Area. About 80% of the state's precipitation occurs in that area. But 80% of the population is south of the Bay Area. So we have a mismatch in terms of where the water is versus where the people are. And the State Water Project was one of a number of large-scale efforts that was intended to address that by bringing water, roughly speaking, from the north of California down to the south. A lot of the water from the State Water Project goes to urban Southern California, but also the Central Coast, the Bay Area, and then agricultural customers in the San Joaquin Valley.
So we get about 2.5 million acre feet of water annually, I believe, is the number from there. For those who don't know, acre foot is enough water to cover a full acre, almost a football field, with the water being about 1 foot in depth. So picture that 2.5 million times, and that accounts for a fair amount of water, I would say.
It does.
So you said it kind of comes from north to south. Where does it roughly start at?
Well, it starts in a number of rivers in Northern California, and then there are some collection points. The water is wheeled through the Delta, which is an important ecosystem in California. It's wheeled through the Delta and then conveyed south. There are other parts of the State Water Project that operate in different areas, but what I'm describing is sort of the main flow of it.
So speaking on the Delta and kind of its ecosystem, can you talk a little bit about what makes it so unique?
Sure. And it's kind of a unique thing about California that our water conveyance systems are a combination of canals and pipelines, but then also natural systems like the Bay Delta estuary. The Delta is home to a number of endangered species, Delta smelt, a number of other aquatic species. But the Delta is also a very important part of the so-called Pacific Flyway that's used by migratory waterfowl. as well as being an important commercial resource. There's a number of commercial fisheries that depend directly and indirectly on the Delta. It's used a lot for recreation. It's a great resource for the state.
Are you able to talk much about the State Water Project and then kind of the Central Valley Project as well? Because I know there's a bit of a dynamic there as well.
Sure. So the Central Valley Project is another one of those projects that I was talking about a minute ago that are designed to convey water from north to south in California. The Central Valley Project is federal. It's operated by the Bureau of Reclamation, which is part of the Department of the Interior. And while the Central Valley Project does have some urban customers like Santa Clara Valley, it's primarily an agricultural project. It supports farming at a large number of acres in the San Joaquin Valley. The State Water Project, by contrast, tilts more urban.
So that section being kind of federally handled, so there's a pretty important relationship, I guess, between state and federal. There's a big federal impact that this water system has on the whole country, you would say.
Oh, there is, sure.
Okay, so kind of jumping more into the economics of it, you had helped author a study titled "The Economy of the State Water Project." So I'd say you're probably the person to talk to about that. How many people are served by the State Water Project?
Yeah, great question. In California, about 27 million people consume water from the State Water Project. And again, that's going to be a lot in Southern California. The State Water Project accounts for about 30% of overall water use in Southern California. The other components of that are water from the Colorado River. So those are the two main imported sources, the Delta and the Colorado. But then there's also a lot of local supplies in Southern California, groundwater, increasingly desalination, recycled water, stormwater that's been captured, things of that nature. But the State Water Project is a very important part of the mix in Southern California. And then again, there's areas of the Central Coast, Silicon Valley, and then the agricultural customers in the San Joaquin Valley.
Well, I think I read from your report too, it breaks it down to basically like 1 in 12 Americans are impacted by the State Water Project. So this is, I think the point to really try and get across here is like, this is so much bigger than just California. This is the whole country that is dependent.
It's very, I'm sorry to talk over you. It's very important context. 27 million people is obviously a large population, but it's also a large economy that ultimately is dependent on imported surface water. You have within the State Water Project service territory, if that were a country in its own right, it would have a GDP of about $2.3 trillion annually. And that would make it bigger than Canada, bigger than Brazil, bigger than Italy, smaller than the United Kingdom and France, but a very large economy in its own right.
Something that you touched on a lot too is, this is not just an urban or a rural thing, but this impacts all industries, all types of people. What are some challenges that we're finding with the current infrastructure?
So there's a whole series of short-term and long-term challenges that the State Water Project is forced to manage around right now. In the short term, obviously, the weather changes from one year to another. We have wet years, dry years, and seemingly we're having wetter wet years and drier dry years and more variability than we used to. So that's clearly a challenge year to year. But it's also true that over the long term, climate change is expected to play a very large impact in terms of how the State Water Project is operated and the level of deliveries that we can expect from it. Another long-term challenge that I think has been recognized for some time now, but still exists, is the threat of a seismic event, a large earthquake on a fault in or probably more likely near the Delta, like the San Andreas or the Hayward faults. Because so much of the Delta was not engineered, sort of built up over time, the levee systems in particular. Many of them are quite vulnerable to ground shift and can result in liquefaction and certain number of islands, levees failing, islands flooding. And that would cause potentially the delta to become unusable for water exports for some period of time till the system was rehabilitated.
So that's mildly terrifying, especially considering, earthquakes are not an uncommon thing in California, as you can imagine. So I know this is something Director Nemeth has definitely touched on a lot about kind of the vulnerabilities to natural phenomenon. And that's why it's so important for us to start looking into modernization. Can we talk a little bit about Delta Conveyance Project?
Sure. So the Delta Conveyance Project is an effort to, if you will, modernize the conveyance system in and around the Delta. And it would do that by adding additional diversion points on the Sacramento River, and then have that in addition to the current south of Delta diversion points. But then that water would be conveyed to the south to all the State Water Project customers.
So in essence, it would be a solution to any vulnerabilities that we currently have, or to many of the vulnerabilities it currently has.
It would be, yes. The Delta Conveyance Project would definitely address the long-term threats from both climate change, in particular sea level rise, but then the kind of underlying threat of seismic risks.
So the next question is going to be, because this seems like a very common sense thing that we should fix this, but the question is going to be, how much does it cost?
Sure. It is expensive, but when evaluating the costs, I think it's important to think not just about how much will it cost, but what will the state get in return, right? That's the way we'd evaluate any investment, whether it's high-speed rail or a new freeway, new hospital, anything like that. And remember, before we were talking about the size of the economy that's supported by the State Water Project. One of the conclusions of our research is that ensuring a reliable water supply to that large economy actually has tremendous economic benefits. And while it is absolutely the case that the Delta Conveyance Project will entail some large capital expenditures and then operating costs as it goes on, it's also true, we believe, that the benefits it produces through increased water supply reliability and improved water quality more than outweigh, in fact, more than twice as large as the costs.
Well, I would say even, economic benefit aside, we're talking about water here. This is not a luxury. This is a necessity for life. So when you, I think, factor that in, and then the fact that, there is a return on investment here, there is a benefit to our economy, not to mention just better water stability and quality. I think, to me, the argument really makes itself. So, yeah.
We were talking about earthquakes a minute ago. Some of the scenarios there are actually pretty sobering. The state has looked at what might happen to the Delta in the event of a natural hazard like an earthquake pretty extensively. And there are scenarios that would involve no water exports from the Delta for a period of 8-9 months, or potentially even longer. And imagine if that occurred in a very dry year when reservoirs are already depleted and customers are relying on imports of water from the Delta. Well, there could be some pretty significant impacts in that case that would affect even residential customers, being able to, potentially not take a shower every day, not wash your clothes as often as you would like. These would be major quality of life impacts. And again, if you have the right combination of things occurring, these are not far-fetched scenarios, but that's the kind of outcome that can be prevented through investment in the Delta Conveyance Project.
I was balancing on this to how doom and gloom do I want to get with this, but it's really easy to kind of get there with this, because one earthquake, one natural event, and suddenly our way of life changes pretty quickly.
Sure. I mean, there have been some instances in particular locations during particular years in California where, again, businesses, but even residential customers have had to endure some pretty significant changes to their quality of life due to a lack of water availability. The thing that we've really focused on is sea level rise. The sea level rise out to 2070 or beyond, when the sea level comes up, the delta gets saltier, and then the pumps can operate less often. So the thing that's worth saying, I think, is, if we just take the current infrastructure and run it off into the future, what we're looking at is losing about a quarter of deliveries on the state water project. And that's what the DCP would prevent. It would largely mitigate against that because it adds this other diversion point that's less susceptible to sea level rise. But again, I think, what I've found with other audiences expressing it in terms of, losing a quarter of the supplies on the state water project, that's obviously a big number. And I personally think that's conservative.
So this is something that we're probably seeing more and more as years progress, regardless of whether we have wet years, dry years.
Oh, sure. Right. The climate is predicted to change, as we get out into the operating life of the DCP. And in particular, the amount of deliveries that could be made on the state water project with the current infrastructure in place would be about almost a quarter lower than at present. So imagine that you have Southern California, 30% of the water is coming from the Delta, and then year in, year out, you're losing almost a quarter of that. It got clearly the potential for some large economic impacts without some kind of a program to mitigate that.
So Delta Conveyance project is really about planning ahead more than anything, as opposed to having to, because I would imagine whatever price tag is attached to it currently is going to be exponentially higher than fixes we have to make after a disaster or after something has happened.
It's a good point. Whatever the costs of the DCP are, it's important to remember that doing nothing, just running off into the future with our current infrastructure, that has costs too. And some of the costs could be have to invest more in water supply alternatives that are more expensive. Some of the costs could be more frequent and more severe water shortages. Costs could be changes in business activity as businesses have to cut back more frequently. So one of the ways of thinking about our work has been to show that the cost of doing nothing is actually greater than the cost of the DCP.
So in our area, the Inland Empire, Riverside County area, we have a huge agricultural customer population. Mm-hmm. This is something that would obviously be of great importance to them. I know that that's been a community that's been very involved in this. Can you talk a little bit about what this solution would mean for them as well?
Sure. So the DCP is very important to the agricultural sector for a couple of reasons. Has sort of direct and indirect impacts. The direct impacts are obviously farming is dependent on imported water in many parts of California. So if we're able to stabilize, make more reliable exports out of the Delta, that allows farming to take place on a more regular basis. And that has benefits for farmers, but also for farm workers, for people who deal tractors and mechanical, people who sell diesel fuel, downstream of agriculture, people who work in processing plants or trucking companies, shippers. The benefits spread all over the state economy of having a more stable and strong agricultural sector.
Is it fair to say, are there global impacts to this, even outside of just America?
Oh, certainly. There are some crops, like certain nut crops that we grow in California, that account for a substantial share of the world's supply. And while it is true, if less is grown in California, more might be grown in some other locations, but we're quite efficient here. with many crops, and there would be an economic loss, and in some cases, higher prices for food products paid by consumers as a result.
Wow. So this really, I think the title we went with for this was appropriate in the sense of, the world should care about this, not just the U.S., not just California, and certainly not just water districts. This has major ramifications globally. That's this is a dangerous topic to ignore. Certainly.
Yeah.
Is there a single concept that if you could communicate to, I guess, policymakers, you would want to get across?
Yeah, sure. Probably a couple, if I could.
Sure.
Yeah, one is that the status quo in the Delta is unsustainable, and we've known that for some time now. One way or another, things are going to change. They can change by investing in the DCP, or they can change by not investing in the DCP, and then we let processes of climate change and seismic risk run their course. One way of thinking about our work is that the cost of doing nothing is significantly higher than the cost of investing in the DCP. So, not trying to minimize at all the fact that this is a large capital project, but our view is that based on the work we've done, the benefits more than justify the costs. We're finding benefits are greater than twice as large as the cost. Another thing I would say is that climate change is real. It's upon us. We're seeing the effects in different ways, really on a daily basis now. The DCP is a way to make an investment to maintain the reliability, maintain roughly the current level of deliveries on the State Water Project in the face of climate change, in particular sea level rise, which has a pretty great impact on the Delta. So a common misconception about the DCP is that it's somehow an expenditure that will greatly increase exports out of the Delta and therefore result in some environmental harms. That is not the case. The DCP, rather, think of it like an insurance policy where spend the money and then we keep deliveries roughly at their current level going off into the future. It's not a water grab. It's not a way to get a lot of extra supplies. It's a way of maintaining what we have right now by investing in some new diversion facilities.
So kind of piggybacking on that then, is there opposition from like environmental community or anyone else?
Sure, there's opposition from some sectors or some segments of the environmental community, but then also from some local communities in the area of the Delta who have, I think, quite understandable concerns about what might happen during the construction period, what might happen to water quality when the tunnel is in operation, a lot of which has been addressed in the EIR and in other processes, but understandable concerns from different parts of the state. So the environmental impact report that was done on the DCP outlines a whole series of potential harms that could cause or could be felt in the Delta, primarily around the construction process. And this is everything from increased traffic congestion to noise pollution to air pollution, what happens to the mud that's dredged up, a whole range of impacts. And the EIR outlines a series of dozens or more mitigation measures for all of those things. There are still some unmitigated impacts, but we considered that as part of our economic analysis and found that, while those impacts are real, they're actually quite modest in relation to the statewide or, as you mentioned, global benefits of the DCP.
So to kind of start closing us out here, I did want to ask, are there any areas that you want to touch on that maybe we didn't yet, or points that you think are important to be made?
Again, the thing that I would emphasize personally is, thinking of the DCP as a project to mitigate the effects of climate change. That's kind of the innovation in this administration, and I think it's right on, what would happen to water supplies as climate change and sea level rise continues to occur? And then what would it look like with investment in the DCP? And again, roughly with the DCP, we maintain current levels of deliveries. Without it, we're at risk of losing almost a quarter of state water project deliveries by 2070 and potentially more beyond that.
Dr. Sunding, this has been incredibly helpful and really interesting. And I think this is something that's really going to connect with our listeners and with our region especially, and hopefully a lot more people outside of that as well. So really want to thank you once again for coming on here and sharing your insight and your expertise with us.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.